90 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. Chair recognizes Mr. Burleson. A recorded vote has been requested and ordered as previously announced. Further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 4435, the Unauthorized Spending Accountability Act, or USA Act. The clerk will please report the bill.
H.R. 4435, a bill to establish a budgetary level reduction schedule and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill should be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4435 as offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purpose of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and the amendment. Congressional Republicans are committed to ensuring that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely on federal government programs. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal government spent $510 billion on programs with expired authorizations in fiscal year 2023. About half of these programs expired more than a decade ago, and this is unacceptable. Congress needs to pay closer attention to the many federal programs left on autopilot. These programs are operating without diligent congressional oversight and timely legislative authorizations to keep these programs relevant to the challenges of today. The Unauthorized Spending Accountability Act, or USA Act, addresses this problem by requiring Congress to review unauthorized programs on a recurring basis. It also creates a clear process for terminating programs that are no longer needed or which do not have the legislative support within Congress for their reauthorization. The bill would implement a gradual reduction in the overall appropriated funding levels over a 3-year period for the total amount of unauthorized programs. This gives Congress time to consider each program and pass necessary reauthorization legislation. It's not too much to ask that Congress provide the appropriate level of scrutiny over the federal programs it has established and find the time every 3 years to ensure that federal funds are being used responsibly and effectively. The time frame under the USA Act forces that to happen. This bill will increase government efficiency, improve the effectiveness of federal agency programs and missions, and help reduce government spending. I want to thank my House colleague, Energy and Commerce Committee Chairwoman Kathy McMorris Rogers, for working with me on this important legislation. I call upon my colleagues to support this necessary legislation. I now recognize the ranking member for his statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. You know, the Constitution has an appropriations clause, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, but it doesn't have an authorization clause. In other words, Congress must appropriate money for it to be spent, but it doesn't have to authorize money to be spent. It can just appropriate it. The distinction between authorization and appropriation is a parliamentary expedient, which Congress has used in order to clarify and elucidate the process. The H.R. 4435, the Unauthorized Spending Accountability Act, should perhaps be renamed the Dysfunction Proliferation Act because it would mire congressional proceedings down in a new and overwhelmingly untenable workload and threaten important federal programs. It would ultimately terminate all discretionary federal programs without permanent authorizations that are not expressly reauthorized by Congress at least every 3 years, a radical departure from current congressional practice and one that has no basis in the Constitution. Congress routinely appropriates funding for important programs and activities whose authorizations have lapsed, including an estimated $510 billion in 2023. This bill would wreak havoc on important government programs and services that our constituents rely on every single day, programs like hospital care and medical services for veterans, Section 8 housing assistance, Pell Grants for America's college students, and essential Head Start programs for children. The GAO's definitive guide on the principles of appropriations law states that the very existence of a statute that requires funding in order to perform substantive functions, quote, is itself sufficient legal authorization for the necessary appropriations. In other words, Whether or not a federal program's authorization is expired is of virtually no consequence to federal agencies, the rule of law, the courts, or our constituents who depend on them. This GOP bill benefits absolutely no one but extremist MAGA lawmakers who want to defund programs and entire agencies and offices that they just don't like. According to the CBO, in fiscal year 2023, Congress saw fit to appropriate funding toward 428 expired authorizations associated with extensively deliberated and well-supported public laws, including the Veterans Health Care Eligibility Reform Act, the 21st Century Cures Act, the Violence Against Women Act, and many more. An additional 355 authorizations expire this year. If this bill were to become law, Mr. Comer's fellow committee chairs would need to immediately set aside their agendas for the rest of the term to deal with the self-inflicted catastrophe of these reauthorization needs, which would consume up vast amounts of time and resources and likely still fail given the dysfunctional nature of the House Republican caucus, which we've seen on display recently. If my colleagues are sincere in their interest to address some of the incoherence of the authorization and appropriations practices in Congress, I would embrace a serious analysis and transparent process to examine viable alternatives. This should include the solicitation of views from Democratic and Republican committee leadership, consideration of recommendations arising from rigorous academic studies of Congress, and a technical assistance from both federal agencies and community groups to understand the full implications of proposed changes. Such scrutiny would clearly show that this Dysfunction Expansion Act is a thinly veiled attempt just to kneecap vital federal programs, taking Congress's internal problems and then making them all of the problems of America. I urge my colleagues to do the obvious thing and join me in opposing this ill-conceived legislation that will defund veterans' health care, housing assistance, programs helping college students afford their tuition, and programs that support early education for infants and children across the country. If we want to do this, let's do it seriously with some hearings. And I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following documents. A letter to this committee in support of the USA from the National Taxpayer Union. Without objection, so ordered. Do any other members wish to be heard?
I have an amendment at the desk now, Mr. Chairman.
Will the clerk please report the amendment?
Amendment number 1 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4435 offered by Mr.